It began as a mistake, not a failure calculation or a misheard order, but a simple, quiet error in judgment. So small it would have been invisible on a star chart. The Corvus Ascendant, a battered Cobra-class destroyer on a long-range patrol beyond the galactic rim, was running silent, its hull still scarred from a skirmish with raiders we never identified. Our navigator, an ancient, wheezing man named Valtor, whose third eye was milky with cataracts, had taken us a fraction of a light year off the prescribed patrol vector, seeking calmer tides in the Imperium. He'd whispered of a stain on the warp ahead, a psychic bruise he wished to avoid. In doing so, he steered us directly into the heart of another, the ship growing out of the warp, not into the cold, clean void we expected, but into a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against the hull. And there, hanging in the black, was a world that wasn't on any of our charts. Its name, etched in fractured low Gothic on a lone, drifting buoy, was Hawkins. The mistake wasn't finding it. The mistake was thinking we could leave. If you find yourself lost in the dark with us, consider lighting a beacon. Your subscription. It signals the Astronomican in the sea of data. It lets us know we are not broadcasting into the void. And now we descend. The shuttle's descent was a violent, shuddering protest. The atmosphere of Hawkins didn't welcome us. It fought us, a thick, soupy envelope that gripped the hull with turbulent, unseen hands. Through the reinforced viewport, the world resolved from a blur of gray and green into a landscape of muted, dying colors. Forests were not vibrant, but stained the deep, weary green of old bruises. The rivers that cut through the continents looked less like water and more like veins of tarnished lead, flowing slow and heavy under a sky the color of cooled ash. No orbital debris, no signs of lance bombardment or macroshell impacts marred the surface. The silence on the planet was total, a void where it should have been the faint, chaotic buzz of human life, Vox traffic, power grid hum, the distant thunder of manufacturing engines. There was nothing. This silence was our first warning, and we failed to understand its language. Lieutenant Aaron Kalin, a man whose face was more scar tissue than skin after 2 decades on the rim, was the first to speak after the landing gear groaned into the soft, black soil. Perimeter sweep, standard dispersal pattern. Vox check every 60 seconds. If it's empty, it's ours. If it's not, we hold and call in. His voice was gravel in a tin, familiar and strangely comforting. We were 17 souls, a mix of naval armsmen, and the ship's few surviving Imperial guardsmen, loaned as muscle. I was among them, a sergeant named Varco, my lost rifle feeling suddenly like a child's toy against the oppressive quiet. We moved out. The air was cold, a dry chill that seeped through our fatigues and bit at exposed skin. It carried a scent. Ozone, yes, like after a storm, but underneath it, the faint, coppery tang of blood that wasn't there and the dry, dusty smell of forgotten places. The settlement of Perdition's Reach emerged from the gray mist like a ghost from a lake. It was a standard Imperial frontier template. Prefabricated plasteel hab blocks, a central administrative building with a faded Imperial Aquila above the door, a small Prometheum depot, a chapel to the God Emperor with a cracked bell. It was not ruined. That was the second, more terrible warning. Every structure was intact. Windows were unbroken. Doors were shut, some even locked, but nothing moved. No faces peered from windows. No patrols walked the gravel paths. The only sound was our own breathing, the crunch of our boots and the nervous rustle of our gear. It was a museum diorama titled A Perfect Imperial Outpost, and we were the only living exhibits. Private Everin, the youngest of us, found the first evidence of life, or rather, its sudden departure. He nudged open the door to a mess hall with the barrel of his lost gun. Inside, under the weak gray light filtering through dusty windows, a scene was frozen in time. Plates of now desiccated, unrecognizable food sat on tables. Cups of recaf, long evaporated, left dark rings like stains of time. A data slate lay on the floor, its screen dark. A child stuffed toy, a crude approximation of a Grox, was propped against a bench leg. There were no bones, no signs of violence, no blood splatter or energy scoring on the walls. It was as if every single inhabitant, in the middle of a bite or a sentence or a thought, had been plucked from existence by a silent, impossibly tidy god. The dread was no longer a subtle feeling. It became a solid thing in my gut, cold and heavy. We cleared the mess hall, then the adjacent hab block. The story was the same in every unit. A family's quarters had clothes laid out on a bed, as if for the next day. A scribe's desk was covered in parchment, a pen lying across a half-completed inventory log for lubricants and ceramite sealant. In a small kitchen, a pot of something thick and congealed sat on a cold heating coil. The most unsettling detail was the dust. It lay everywhere, a fine, gray blanket over every surface, but was undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, no signs of panic or flight. Only the slow, gentle settling of abandonment over years, perhaps decades. Tech Adept Ren, who had accompanied us as our liaison to the machine spirits, ran a scanner over a dormant lumen globe. His mechadendrites, the snaking metal tentacles grafted to his spine, twitched in a restless, nervous pattern I'd never seen before. No power grid failure, he buzzed through his Vox grill, his voice a synthetic monotone that couldn't hide a certain perplexity. Local energy cells are depleted from maintaining life support for standard duration post-desertion. Calculations suggest they failed approximately 7 standard years ago. Prior to that, systems were active and nominal. He paused, the red lenses of his optical implants glowing in the dim room. The inhabitants did not leave. Systems were not shut down. They simply stopped being used. The third warning came from the chapel. Its heavy wooden doors, carved with scenes of the Emperor's sacrifice, swung inward without a sound. Inside, the air was still and smelled of old incense and damp stone. The pews were empty. At the altar, a great book of liturgy lay open, but the candlesticks were toppled. The thick devotional candles snapped and rolled across the floor. And on the wall behind the altar, where a majestic icon of the God Emperor of mankind should gaze down with stern, divine authority, there was only a blank, scarred patch of plaster. The icon was gone, not torn down, but carefully, meticulously removed. Only the faint outline of its shape remained, a ghostly silhouette that screamed a deliberate, sacrilegious erasure. Lieutenant Kalen stood before the empty space, his hand resting on the grip of his bolt pistol. He didn't speak for a long time. Sergeant Varco, he finally said, his voice low, report to the Corvus. Tell the captain we have found a settlement in perfect physical condition. Population, 0, cause unknown. And tell him the God Emperor has been scrubbed from his own house. I nodded, the cold in my gut now a block of ice. The promise a simple survey. Map the terrain, confirm the absence of Xenos or heresy, plant the Imperial Aquila, lay shattered around us. This was not an empty world. It was a waiting one. I made my way back through the silent streets, the sense of being watched a physical pressure between my shoulder blades. The gray sky seemed lower, heavier. As I reached the landing zone at the edge of town, I turned for one last look at Perdition's Reach. The settlement sat in its valley, neat and complete, a perfect picture of Imperial order. And then I saw it. In the upper window of the administrative building, the one we had not yet entered, a shadow moved. It was quick, just a flicker of deeper darkness against the gloom inside. It could have been a trick of the light, my own fatigued mind painting threats on the blank canvas. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled my blood, that it was not. We were not alone here. We were just the latest exhibit to arrive. The silence was not emptiness. It was patience. And our presence had just been acknowledged. We made our base in the mess hall, the place of the interrupted last meal. It felt like a grim joke, setting up our field comms and rations among the relics of a vanished community. Lieutenant Kalen ordered a rotating watch, 2 soldiers at the doors and 1 on the roof with a magnocular. The rest of us tried to rest, but sleep was a traitor in that place. The silence was too loud. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was a vacuum that pulled at your ears, making you hear the frantic thunder of your own heartbeat, the rush of blood in your skull. It was in this oppressive quiet that the whispers began. Private Everin, on his first watch at the north door, was the one who mentioned it. He thought his Vox bead was malfunctioning. "Sergeant," he said, his young voice tight. "You hear that? Sounds like singing." I listened, pressing the bead in my ear. Beneath the usual comforting wash of white noise, the static that was the voice of a functioning Vox network, there was something else. A faint rhythmic pattern, almost melodic. It was a ghost of a lullaby. A few haunting notes that looped and then dissolved back into the hiss. I shook my head at Everin. Grid interference. This place is dead. It's just bleed from the geomagnetic field. I said it with a conviction I didn't feel. Tech Adept Ren, who was interfaced with the main comms unit, his mechadendrites plugged into its ports, jerked suddenly. His whole body stiffened, a low, binary stutter escaping his grill. "Negative," he buzzed, the word clipped and strained. "The signal is not natural. It is structured. It carries linguistic markers." The whispers didn't stay whispers for long. As the long, gray hours of the Hawkins night deepened, the Vox channel grew crowded. The white noise would part like a curtain and voices would spill out. They were faint, layered over one another, a cacophony of despair. A woman's voice, sharp with panic, crying, the shadows have teeth." A man screaming a name, "Lydia! Lydia!" Over the roar of what sounded like artillery. A child, sobbing quietly, repeating, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." They spoke in a dozen dialects of Gothic, in languages I'd never heard, in guttural barks that might have been orc, in the chilling, metallic screech of something utterly alien. They were the last words, the final thoughts of beings across the galaxy, trapped in their moment of utmost terror and pain, and they were broadcasting directly into our skulls. The effect on the squad was immediate and corrosive. We were soldiers. We were trained for tangible threats. The charging orc, the ambushing Eldar, the shambling horror of the Tyranid swarm. This was an attack on the mind, and we had no defenses. Men began jumping at nothing. Their eyes darting the corners where the shadows now seemed to cling a little too thickly. Conversations died mid-sentence as a particularly loud scream or plea would burst from a Vox. Private Everin grew pale and withdrawn, his hands constantly moving, checking and rechecking the power pack on his lost gun. The whispers were no longer just in our ears. I began to hear them in the creak of the building's settling structure, in the sigh of the wind outside, as if the very air of Hawkins was saturated with these sonic ghosts. Lieutenant Kalen ordered a comms blackout, save for emergency channel burst beacons. It was a logical order. It did nothing. The voices simply got louder, clearer, as if angered by our attempt to mute them. They were coming from the world itself. Tech Adept Ren became our focal point, not by choice, but by cruel necessity. His mechanical augmentations, his direct neural interface with the machine, made him a superior receiver. He sat rigid in his corner, cables snaking from his skull ports to the data slate before him, which now scrolled with endless, gibberish script, a visual representation of the psychic noise. His organic eye was wide, bloodshot, fixed on nothing. His mechadendrites twitched and spasmed independently, like beheaded snakes. "It is not a transmission," he grated out, his voice fluctuating with strain. "It is a resonance, a recording. This planet, its mineral composition, its electromagnetic field, it is acting as a psychic capacitor. It absorbed the emotional energy of every death, every trauma that occurred here, and now it plays them back. The warp is thin here. It bleeds through. And Hawkins remembers. The concept was too vast, too horrifying to fully grasp. We weren't being haunted by the dead of perdition's reach. We were standing inside a galaxy-sized phonograph needle, stuck on the screams. The decision was made to retreat, to fall back to the shuttle in orbit, to let the Mechanicus send a full sanitization team. The mission was over. Survival was now the only objective. We packed our gear with frantic speed, desperate to escape the auditory torture chamber the mess hall had become. As we formed up to move out, the Vox on my belt, set to the silent emergency band, crackled to life, not with a ghost voice, with a clean, strong Imperial signal. It was a voice I knew. It was Captain Vorlis, commander of the Corvus Ascendant. "Ground team, this is Corvus Actual. Report status. You've been silent for 18 hours. A localized ion storm is gathering on your continent. Advise immediate extraction. Prepare for dust-off in 30 minutes. Acknowledge. Hope, sharp and painful, lands through me. I key my mic. Corvus Actual, this is Sergeant Varco. Acknowledge. We are Oscar Mike to LZ now. Situation is the signal dissolved. Not into static, but into a wet, choking gurgle, the sound of a man drowning in his own blood. Then a new voice, cold and clear and dripping with malignant amusement, whispered through the speaker. It was Captain Vorlis's voice, but twisted. Stay a while, Sergeant. The performance is just beginning. The channel went dead. Above us, through the grimy windows, the gray sky remained perfectly, terribly calm. There was no storm. The voice from our ship had been a lie, and we were now completely, utterly alone. Flight is a primal instinct, a hardwired circuit that overrides reason. The moment that corrupted transmission ended, that instinct seized every one of us. We didn't march for the landing zone. We fled. Our formation, a thing of disciplined pride, shattered into a ragged, stumbling rush through the gravel streets of Perdition's Reach. The weight of our gear, once familiar, now felt like lead shackles. The silence was gone, replaced by a new, active malice. The whispering vox static was now the background hum to a symphony of personalized terror. As we passed the darkened mouth of an alley, I heard my mother's voice, calling my name with the same tender worry she'd used when I was a feverish child. A mother dead for 15 years. Her voice pulled from the deepest vault of my memory. I didn't look. I ran faster. The environment itself began to conspire against us. It was subtle at first. Things you could almost dismiss as imagination strained to its breaking point. The shadows cast by the low, gray sun seemed to stretch a little further than they should, reaching for our ankles like grasping fingers. Passing a shattered shop front, the jagged glass in the window frame reflected not my own panic face, but a skeletal visage, my own death mask grinning back at me for a fraction of a second. The air temperature would plummet in random patches, a bone-deep cold that fogged our breath and made our hands ache on our weapons, only to return to the ambient chill a few paces later. Hawkins was no longer a passive recorder. It had an audience now, and it was using everything in its arsenal to elicit the reactions it fed upon. Our fear was no longer a byproduct. It was the crop, and the harvest had begun. The first casualty was Private Everin. He was running just ahead of me, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. We were passing the small chapel, its empty niche where the Emperor's icon had been a black, accusing hole. Everin suddenly screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure horror, and skidded to a halt. He raised his lost rifle, not towards any threat, but toward the empty sky, firing shot after shot on full auto until the power pack died with a sickly whine. "Get it off! Get it off me!" he shrieked, clawing at his own face, his neck, his arms. To the rest of us, there was nothing there, but in his eyes, reflected in the maddened gleam, I saw the awful truth. He was reliving something. His body was here on Hawkins, but his mind was trapped elsewhere in a moment of such perfect, personal terror that it had overwritten reality itself. He collapsed to his knees, then onto his side, curling into a fetal position. His screams dissolved into choked whimpers, then into a continuous, mumbled stream of words. He was speaking the dialogue of his own nightmare, responding to phantoms only he could see, his face a mass of agony. He was gone. Tech-adept Ren scanned him with shuddering mechadendrite. Life sign stable. Severe psychic trauma. Cerebral activity is a recursive loop. He is stuck. We couldn't carry him. We could only drag him, a weeping, babbling anchor of human suffering. And his fear, so potent, so fresh, seemed to pour into the very stones of the street, making the whispering voices around us grow louder, more eager. Our retreat became a nightmare procession through a town that knew us better than we knew ourselves. Every corner held an auditory ambush. A grizzled veteran named Boric threw himself against a wall, covering his ears as the Vox in his helmet screamed with the specific, piercing whistle of an incoming Tyranid bioshell, the very sound that had heralded the death of his entire squad on Typhon Primaris. Another soldier, Cella, froze in the middle of the road, her eyes wide as she stared at a flickering, phantom image of her burned-out Hablock on Krieg, the smell of promethium and charred flesh so vivid to her that she vomited onto the gravel. Hawkins was a master chemist, isolating the pure, potent toxin of each individual's worst memory and injecting it directly into their soul. Lieutenant Kalen fought it with cold, brutal discipline, barking orders, slapping men who were seizing up, his own face a rigid mask. But I saw the tremor in his hands. I heard the way his voice would catch when a faint, remembered echo of a different voice, a fallen comrade, a lost love, would whisper from a rusted drain grate. We were no longer hunters, or even explorers. We were prey, and the predator was a collective, psychic resonance of an entire planet's worth of agony. It learned from us. It adapted. The phenomena became less random, more targeted. The chilling cold would settle specifically on a man whose home world was an ice ball. The whispers would mimic the accent of a soldier's lost kin. It was breaking us down, not with claws and teeth, but with the weapons we carried inside our own skulls. We finally reached the edge of the settlement, the open, dead fields between us and the relative safety of the shuttle, just visible a kilometer away across the blasted heath. It was a killing ground without cover, and every instinct screamed that crossing it was suicide. But staying in the town, which now felt like a living, hungry throat, was a slower, more terrible death. Kalen looked at the catatonic Everin, at the shivering, broken remains of his squad. His jaw tightened. We run. Now. No stopping. If you fall, you are left. That is an order. It was the only order left to give. We took a collective, shuddering breath, and burst from the cover of the last Hablock into the open, gray light. We didn't make it 100 meters. The ground beneath us did not tremble. It sighed, a great, weary exhalation of air, thick with the smell of ozone and that coppery tang, erupted from 1,000 tiny fissures in the hard-packed soil. And with it rose the light, not a light from above, but from below, a sickly, pulsing violet illumination that seeped up from the planet's depths, staining the gray air with an otherworldly glow. It originated from a point ahead of us, just to the left of our path to the shuttle. As we stumbled to a halt, the source revealed itself. The ground there was not simply cracked. It was torn, a vast, jagged chasm, hundreds of meters long, ripped through the landscape like a wound that had never healed. Its edges were sharp, unnatural, as if the crust of the planet had been peeled back by a colossal, careless hand. And from its impossible depths, the violet light throbbed in a slow, rhythmic beat, like a diseased heart buried at the core of the world. This was not a geological feature. This was the source. The whispers became a roar, a choir of 1 billion damned souls screaming in unison from that terrible, beautiful, glowing scar. The warp wasn't just thin here. It was bleeding, and we were standing in the runoff. We stood paralyzed at the edge of that impossible light. The psychic roar from the chasm was a physical force, a pressure against a mind that made thought brittle and slow. The whispered voices were gone, swallowed by this monolithic, agonized scream that was not a sound, but vibration in the soul. The violet illumination didn't cast shadows. It consumed them, painting our faces and gear in stark, alien relief, leaching the color from our skin until we looked like corpses standing vigil over our own grave. Lieutenant Kalen was the first to break the stasis. He didn't shout. In the face of that enormity, shouting was a child's gesture. He simply pointed, his arm moving slowly as if pushing through deep water toward a cluster of fallen rock slabs that offered meager cover from the direct glare of the wound. We moved, dragging the unresponsive Everin, our movements clumsy and dreamlike. Huddled behind the cold stone, the direct psychic pressure lessened by a fraction, but the awful truth of where we were settled upon us with the weight of a tomb seal. Tech Adept Ren was shaking, a constant, fine tremor that rattled his metal components. He forced a mechadendrite to plug into his data slate. The other end pointed towards a chasm like a divining rod. Readings scrolled across the screen, a cascade of impossible numbers and warning sigils that bled from Gothic into chaotic machine code. "The rift is stable," he buzzed, the distortion in his voice worse than ever. "Anomalous space-time signature. Local reality is scarred. The laws of physics are attenuated within a 5-kilometer radius. This is not a natural formation. This is a permanent puncture." He looked up, his red lenses reflecting the pulsating violet. The warp is not a sea we sail upon here. It is a wound, seeping into Imperium. Hawkins is not haunted. It is infected. The memories, the echoes, they are the psychic pus weeping from the terror. The scale of it dwarfed our understanding. This wasn't about a missing colony. This was about a fundamental break in the universe, a crack in the wall that separated reality from the realm of pure thought and emotion. Every terrible thing we had experienced, the whispers, the cold, the phantom horrors, was just a symptom. The sickness was the rift itself. I thought of the carefully removed icon in the chapel. Had some lass, desperate faithful, tried to use her faith as a bandage, praying to the Emperor to seal this bleed? Or had something from the other side of that tear demanded its removal as an act of defiance? The questions were vast and terrifying. In the shadow of that glowing scar, the idea of a hostile Xeno's presence, of a genestealer cult, even a demonic incursion, felt almost comforting. Those were enemies you could fight. This was a condition, a state of being. How do you wage war on a wound? As we watched, the rift demonstrated its nature. The violet light within its depths swelled, the pulsation quickening from the lip of the chasm, the air visibly warped, shimmering like heat haze on a desert planet. And within that shimmer, images formed. They were not solid, not holograms, but phantasms of light and shadow, projections of the rift's endless, tortured memory. We saw figures in tattered Imperial Guard uniforms from 100 different regiments, locked and silent, repeating battles against foes that were only blurs of darkness. We saw the inhabitants of Perdition's reach, not as they died, but in moments of mundane life. A woman laughing, a man repairing a hydro spanner, a child chasing a ball, all played out in a frantic, skipping loop before dissolving into screams. We saw Xeno shapes, the spindly silhouettes of Eldar, the hulking brutality of orcs, the skeletal, impossible geometry of Necrons, all flickering and dying in flashes of remembered violence. The rift was not just leaking emotion. It was screening the highlight reel of every death, every conflict, every spark of suffering that had ever occurred near it, a chaotic tapestry of agony woven from the lives of countless species across millennia. We were not just looking into a hole in the ground. We were looking into the open nerve ending of the galaxy. A new kind of despair took hold, colder and quieter than the earlier panic. Our shuttle, our escape, sat a mere 800 meters away, across open ground that was now bathed in this distorting, memory-saturated light. To run for it was to expose ourselves directly to the rift's full emanations. In our current state, it would likely shatter what was left of our minds before we took a dozen steps. Lieutenant Kalen assessed the situation with the grim calculus of a commander who has run out of good options. "We cannot cross that field," he stated, his voice flat. "The Corvus is not answering. The shuttle might as well be on the other side of the segmentum." He turned to Tech Adept Ren. "Adept, is there a way to dampen the effect? To block the signal, even for a few minutes?" Ren's mechadendrites writhed in a simulation of deep thought. The phenomenon is empathic and psychically resonant. Standard damping fields would be useless. It is not a machine to be jammed. It is a spiritual infection. He paused, his optical lenses cycling through different spectra as he stared at the chasm. There is a theory, a dangerous one. The planet acts as a receiver and amplifier. To stop the broadcast, one must overload the receiver. The idea hung in the air, more poisonous than the violet light. Overload it. With what? Ren explained, his words clinical, cutting through the psychic drone. The rift feeds on psychic energy, primarily negative, fear, pain, anguish. It amplifies and reflects it. But a receiver can be saturated. If a single, powerful, coherent burst of psychic energy, a focused scream of equal or greater intensity, was directed into the rift, it could, in theory, cause a temporary feedback loop, a cancellation wave. It would not heal the wound. It would shock it into momentary silence, like screaming so loud you drown out every other sound in the room. He looked at each of us, his mechanical face incapable of expression, but the dread in his organic eye was plain. We possess no psychers, but human minds, in extreme states, generate such energy, especially in unison, especially when focused on a single, overwhelming emotional peak. He didn't need to say it. The only emotional peak we had left to offer was our own terror, our own pain, our own acceptance of death. To save ourselves, we would have to consciously pour every ounce of our suffering back into the source. We would have to become part of the haunting. Silence followed Ren's theory. Not the empty silence of before, but a heavy, thick quiet, filled with the understanding of a terrible price. The violet glow from the chasm painted our huddled forms in the color of fresh bruises. Lieutenant Kalen looked from the catatonic Everin to the broken faces of his remaining squad, to the distant, mocking shape of our shuttle. His authority, which had been a rock against a storm of whispers, now seemed a small, fragile thing. He was a commander of men, not an exorcist of worlds. "How?" he asked, the word a blunt instrument. Tech Adept Ren gestured with a trembling mechadendrite toward the town behind us. The settlement's primary communications array. It is damaged, but its core emitter is intact. It is designed to boost signals into the upper atmosphere. With modification, I can reverse its polarity. Instead of broadcasting a message to the stars, it can be tuned to focus a psychic imprint directly into the rift's frequency. A targeted scream. He paused, the whir of his internal systems loud in the quiet. The machine spirit will require a catalyst, a focus for the emotional energy. It will require a conscious, willing mind to interface at the moment of transmission, to channel the collective anguish, to give a voice. No one asked what that would do to the mind serving as the focus. We knew it would be Everin's fate, but conscious, deliberate, and infinitely worse. It would be a soul offering itself to the storm as a living lightning rod. Kalen closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were the eyes of a man who had already made the choice and was now just counting the cost. Sergeant Varco, Chella Boric, you're with me and the Adept. We secure the comms array. The rest of you, he looked at the three other shaken soldiers. You stay with Everin. You guard this position. If this works, you run for the shuttle the second the phenomena stops. You do not look back. You get to the Corvus, and you tell them to broadcast a warning on every channel. This world is not to be colonized. It is not to be touched. It is a tomb for echoes, and it is always hungry. There were no protests, no heroic offers to take another's place. There was only a numb, grim acceptance. We had run out of other roads. The journey back into Perdition's reach was a walk through the aftermath of a psychic bomb. The town, now bathed in the reflected violet light from the rift, was a nightmare gallery. The phantasms were stronger here, more defined. We saw our own ghosts among them, flickering images of ourselves from hours before, searching rooms, our faces etched with concern that now seemed painfully naive. The whispering voices were quiet again, but they held a new, mocking tone, as if the rift knew our intent and found it amusing. We reached the administrative building, its spire now crowned with the skeletal shape of the comms array. Inside, the air was freezing. Ren went to work immediately, his mechadendrite spearing into control panels, rerouting cables, his data slate chiming with frantic calculations. Kalen, Boric, Chella, and I took up defensive positions, our backs to the Adept, our weapons trained on the doors, the windows, the shadows that now seemed to see with independent life. We were not guarding against creatures. We were guarding against the creeping insanity that sought to stop us from making our final, desperate noise. Time lost meaning in that frozen chamber. It was measured in the frantic clatter of Ren's tools, the shuddering of the building as another wave of psychic pressure rolled from the rift, and the increasingly strained sound of our own breathing. The air grew thick with the smell of hot ozone, and a new scent, like burning hair and spilled blood. Phantom figures began to manifest not just as light, but as tactile presences. A cold hand brushed my neck. I heard the rustle of a greatcoat behind me where no one stood. Boric swore, swatting at something invisible crawling on his arm. Chella began to cry silently, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face, as the whispers lovingly recounted the names of her dead siblings. We were breaking, and the rift was savoring it, drawing out the moment, feeding on our crumbling resolve. I need a focus. Ren suddenly shouted, his synthetic voice cracking with strain. A bundle of wires and a neural interface spike gleamed in his hand. connected to humming, overloaded core of the comms unit. The machine spirit is prepared. It awaits the catalyst. It demands a voice to shape the scream. Lieutenant Kalen turned from the window. His face was a monument to exhaustion, but his eyes were clear. He took a step toward the interface spike. I am the commanding officer. The responsibility is mine. I moved before I even thought. My hand closed on his arm. No, sir. The words were out, calm and final. I understood it then. Kalen was our rock, our will. If he burned out his mind in that machine, whatever fragile hope we had of getting anyone off this rock died with him. I was a sergeant. I was a fighter. My job was to protect, to take the blows so others could go on. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that my mind was already a lost cause. The Whispers had already found the secret chambers of my own grief. The memory of my first squad, wiped out in an ambush on a forgotten jungle world, their faces, their screams. That pain was fresh, potent, and ready to be weaponized. The scream needs fuel, Lieutenant. I said, my voice strangely steady. I have plenty. You have to get them to the shuttle. He searched my face, saw the decision there, and gave the smallest, most agonized nod of his life. It was an order accepted and obeyed. There was no ceremony, no grand speech. Tech Adept Ren guided me to a chair before the main console. The neural interface spike was cold against my temple. I looked at Chella, at Boric, at Kalen. Think of the worst of it, I said. The thing you never told anyone. Don't hold back. Give it to me. I closed my eyes. Ren activated the link. The world did not disappear. It exploded. The first wave was my own. It wasn't a memory. It was a reliving. The humid, choking heat of the jungle. The shriek of bioweaponry. The smell of cooked meat and lost fire. Arlo's face, half gone, begging for help. Liana's final curse as she threw a grenade into a chittering horde. The crushing guilt that I had lived when they had not. I screamed, but no sound came from my throat. It was a psychic scream, siphoned directly from the raw nerve of my soul, channeled into the shrieking machine. The comms array hummed, a deep, resonant note that shook the dust from the rafters. Then I felt them, not as whispers, but as open wounds. Kalen's loss, a cold, hard knot of duty and grief for every man and woman he'd ever sent to die. Boric's raw, animal terror of the tyrannid swarm, the feeling of chitinous claws scraping against the soul. Chella's deep, silent mourning for a family and a home reduced to ash, a loneliness so vast it was a universe in itself. Even the shattered, recursive nightmare of Everin, a distant, pulsing signal of pure panic. I was not a mind anymore. I was a conduit, a lightning rod for 17 different kinds of hell. The machine spirit of the array, a furious, wounded thing, seized upon this torrent of pain. It didn't just broadcast it. It amplified it, focused it, honed it into a single, coherent blade of concentrated anguish. I was aware of Ren, a flickering point of cold, logical terror in the storm, his own mind a fortress of data starting to crack. I was aware of the rift outside, a gaping, welcoming maw, eager to consume this new, delicious offering. I did not direct the energy. I simply let it go. I opened every locked door in my mind and their minds and pushed it all, every secret shame, every private horror, every unhealed scar, towards that glowing violet scar in the world. The array emitted its own sound then, a physical, teeth-rattling shriek that tore the material world, a carrier wave for the psychic tsunami. Through the window, I saw the violet light of the rift flare, not brighter, but darker, a deep, bruised purple. The swirling phantasms around it stuttered. The whispers in the air choked, gasped, and fell silent. For a single, held breath, the psychic pressure vanished. The haunting of Hawkins stopped. We had not silenced the recording. We had screamed louder than it, drowning its signal in a wave of our own fresh and infinitely more immediate suffering. The backlash was not pain. It was emptiness, a void where my memories had been. I could remember the facts, the jungle, the names, the faces, but the emotional charge, the searing guilt, the grief, was gone, scoured clean. In its place was a hollow, ringing silence, more profound than any Hawkins had offered. I was a shell. I slumped in the chair, the neural spike falling away, trailing a thread of saliva I couldn't feel. Around me, the others were gasping, clutching their heads, as if a deafening noise had just ceased. The psychic weight was lifted. The air was just air, cold and dead. Lieutenant Kalen was at my side in an instant, his hands on my shoulders. "Varco!" His voice sounded strange, clean, free of the static that had lived in our ears for days. I could see his lips move, read the concern on his face, but I felt nothing about it. I managed a nod, a mechanical jerk of the head. "It's quiet." I rasped, the words tasting of dust. "Go. Now!" Kalen barked at the others. Boric and Chella didn't need telling twice. They grabbed my arms, hauling me to my feet. My legs were numb, but they worked. We staggered from the administratum, Ren stumbling after us, his mechadendrites hanging limp. The town was different. The shadows were just shadows. The air held no whispers, no phantom sense. It was a dead place, truly dead for first time. The violet light from the rift still pulsed, but it was muted, subdued, like a fever that had broken. We ran, not from monsters, but from the scene of a crime we had just committed against reality itself. We reached the rocks where the others waited. The two guards were staring wide-eyed at the quiet chasm. Everin had stopped his endless mumbling. He was unconscious, breathing steadily. "Move." Kalen roared. The run to the shuttle was a blur of gray soil and heaving chests. No cold spots, no phantom hands, no voices. The silence was a gift bought with the currency of our own souls. We piled into the shuttle. Kalen, slamming the hatch, closed himself. The engines whined to life, a beautiful, mechanical sound that promised escape. As we lifted off, the ground falling away, I looked down to the viewport. Perdition's reach was a small, neat stain. The rift was a jagged, glowing cut. And I knew, with the cold certainty of the hollow thing I had become, that was not over. We had not healed the wound. We had not erased the recording. We had simply added a new track to its endless playlist. A track of 17 souls screaming in unison, a perfect, concentrated burst of imperial pain. We had given Hawkins a new memory, a fresh, powerful echo to replay for the next poor souls who made the mistake of finding it. Our suffering was now a permanent part of the atmosphere, etched into the rock, waiting in the silence. We hadn't escaped the ghost. We had become it. The shuttle pierced the cloud layer, and Hawkins vanished from sight, a secret scar on the skin of the galaxy, forever whispering our names into the static between the stars.